Hey guys, going to do a lesson here today on the blues elements of Trey Anastasio's guitar style. A lot of people ask me about this, and it's something that I guess I've almost sort of taken for granted because I really kind of grew up, long before I heard Phish, I was playing kind of blues rock guitar. I was into Clapton and Hendrix and stuff like that. So for those of you who kind of didn't grow up on that background, I wanted to take a bit of a dive into that aspect of Trey's playing because I think it is super important. I think we sometimes get a bit caught up in, kind of the jazz influences of Trey's playing and the prog rock and, the classical stuff that he studied in college and that kind of thing. And, certainly those are all important facets of his playing too. But the truth is, really, at heart, to me, Trey is very much a blues rock guitar player. And in fact, I'd say I probably hear more Hendrix in his guitar style than really anyone else I could pretty much name. So to give us a little bit of context, I picked a version of Funky Bitch to study. It's from 9113 Dick's Sporting Goods Park. The main reason I'm picking it really is because there is a good video of this particular version, and the video focuses almost exclusively on Trey the whole time, so you can get a really good look at what positions he's in and that kind of thing. I'll put a link to that video in the description of this one, and meanwhile, to make this video, I'm going to punch in a few clips that I poached from that video. I did transcribe the entire solo, and I'll put a link to that PDF as well in the description of this video. But in this video, I'm not going to pick apart every single lick of the solo. What I'm going to do is just kind of hit the high points and try to give you a kind of general idea of some of the things Trey does to kind of get this bluesy sound. So Funky Bitch is a blues tune in C. In fact, it's one of the bluesier blues tunes that Phish does. They don't do that many straight-up blues tunes, but this is one of them. It is almost a 12-bar blues, but because there's this funky little turnaround at the end, that actually cuts off one bar of sort of the standard 12-bar blues form, so technically that makes this an 11-bar blues. But in terms of structure and phrasing and all that, this tune really functions like a 12-bar blues, even though it technically is only 11. So before we start digging into this, I do want to go over one thing, which is the C minor pentatonic scale. We are in the key of C, and this song uses really more like dominant 7th chords, C7, F7, and G7. But it's fairly standard blues stuff to go ahead and just use the C minor pentatonic over all of that. So there are a few different ways to think about this. If you are a caged system person, then what you would want to do is look at the relative major of C minor, which is E flat. So the pentatonic scales that correspond to E flat major will also work for C minor. That could maybe be a bit of a convoluted way to think about it, and really for me it's easier to just look at where my C root notes are and then build my minor pentatonic scale off of that. And you may already know there's only really 5 fingerings of the pentatonic scale, so you just have to figure out how to fit these 5 fingerings around your root notes. I also found it interesting to see that Trey really used pretty much all 5 of those pentatonic fingerings in this solo. As I play these, I'm going to try to return to the root notes so you can hear how the scale sounds in relation to its root. Okay, so the first finger I have for C minor pentatonic is here in the 3rd position. You can see it based off of this C here, 3rd fret 5th string, or 5th fret 3rd string, that's C right there. And if it's easier, you can just picture a C minor chord right there, and the scale looks like this. Next fingering is going to be here in the 5th position. There isn't really a C minor chord, at least not a super familiar one, that corresponds to this, but you can still base it off of this C note here. Again, 3rd string, 5th fret. Octave above that here on the 8th fret, and 8th fret on that string as well are all within this one, and the fingering looks like this. Always coming back to that root note so you can hear how it sounds. 8th position is the next place you'd have a C minor pentatonic. Of course, that's a C right there on the 8th fret, and there's a C minor chord right here, of course, too. And then the pentatonic scale that corresponds to all that is very familiar to most of us. 10th position, again, we don't have a real obvious candidate for a C minor chord fingering, but we have this C note here on the 10th fret, 4th string, and then the octave above that on the 13th fret of the 2nd string. And I should point out that mostly when we're in this position, we're working with just this little cluster of notes, like starting with my middle finger on the 12th fret, 3rd string, and then on the next two strings, 11th and 13th frets. Your root notes right there. The whole intro of the song is played exclusively in that position. There were a few licks that I found that he played in the 13th position, what I would call the caged D-shaped pentatonic, which is frankly one that I don't use a whole ton, but I'm playing off of this C here, and I have and then above that, at the 15th fret, we get an octave of what we did here on the 3rd fret earlier, and it starts repeating from there. Okay, so let's dive into this solo and start looking at some of the specific licks that he plays. So the intro of this tune, the first little solo that Trey plays, is some real classic blues stuff along the lines of something you'd hear Buddy Guy play, or Hendrix, or Stevie Ray Vaughan, or Albert Collins. Some real classic blues stuff all happening around this little cluster that I pointed out earlier, like my middle finger here on the 12th fret, 3rd string, and then the 11th and 13th frets of the upper two strings. And that's your root note right there on the 2nd string, 13th fret. First thing that happens is a big bend from this F on the 13th fret. It's a whole step bend, so you're bending that note up to the pitch 2 frets above that. And in order to get that bend good and tight and accurate, even though I'm fretting the note with just my ring finger here, I'm using all 3 of these fingers to push that string up. So another thing I'll point out is how Trey kind of digs into some of these notes. So instead of just playing the one note, what he kind of does is sort of rakes up to that note. And when I do that, I'm actually using the palm of my picking hand and kind of raking through those strings. And then, you know, you're not really hearing any of the other strings. You're not really hearing anything until that first string comes into play. But it really sounds like you're digging into the note when you do it that way. So that's another kind of bluesy thing that you'll see Trey do a lot. So after that bend, Trey comes down to this E flat here on the 11th fret. And that's the minor 3rd in the key of C. And as I mentioned earlier, we're actually working with dominant 7th chords, not minor chords. So that minor 3rd sounds a little funny, and in order to get it to sound right, what Trey does almost every time he hits this note is he bends it just a little bit, and then comes back to the root note there. So he's bending that minor 3rd up towards the major 3rd, which would be right there, just a fret higher. But he doesn't really bend it quite up that high, just a slight little bend, like a quarter step, and then it returns to that root note, and actually does a little pull off there and comes back to it. So you got second lick is almost the same as the first one. Slightly different tag at the end of the lick. Finishes it off by doing this little, almost looks like an arpeggio of an E flat triad, sliding into that first note. Those 2 notes on the 11th fret, bending that upper one again, coming back to your root note. And then he finally ends it off by going. So the whole lick put together is. So he plays that lick over the C chord, which is the 1 chord, and then he does virtually the exact same lick again over the 4 chord. And that is another thing that's real common in the blues. You play a lick over the 1 chord, and then when you get to that 4 chord, you repeat the same lick or something close to it to keep sort of a little bit of thematic sort of coherence to the licks that you're playing. So this last lick is really just another variation of those first 2, But this one does take a little more technical finesse to pull off, and it does incorporate another thing that Trey does pretty frequently. I'll play the lick for you. So the first thing he does is that same bend off of the 13th fret, but this time he cuts it off when he gets to the top of the bend, and then he strikes the note again while it's still bent and releases that bend, so you get... That's a thing you hear Trey do quite a bit, is like, I think what you would call a pre-bend, where you bend the note up, strike it, and release the bend. And that little tag at the end of the lick this time goes... Also slightly more technically difficult to pull off than the other one. This whole next portion happens within this 8th fret fingering of the minor pentatonic scale. It starts with a bend of this note that's here on the 11th fret, a whole step bend. So that's the flatted 7th, B flat, and he's bending it up a whole step to the pitch of the note 2 frets above, which is C, which is your root. And normally, like if I was playing through this scale, I would hit that note with my pinky, but since I'm bending it, I'm going to grab it with this finger so I can use the strength again of all 3 of these fingers to bend it out. And he kind of does that little thing there where he bends it up, releases it, and then rebends it. Then after that, he grabs this note, comes down the scale from there. When he gets to this note of the scale, he bends it up and comes back up to that note. Then from there, grabs this note on the 10th fret, hits it, and then hits it again, and the second time he hits it, he kind of bends it and releases it. After that, he goes back to this note here on the 8th fret under the index finger, and here again we have a minor third, E flat, minor third of the key of C. And again, just like he does elsewhere whenever he hits this E flat note, gives it a little bend. And because it's under this finger, I actually do my bend downwards. It feels a little more comfortable to me. So the whole lick. Sounds very Stevie Ray Vaughan-ish to me. Quickie here, again more licks in this 11th position that I was talking about earlier. Starts off with a couple of those pre-bends. Repeating virtually the exact same lick twice, and then following it up with another repeated lick. So again, repetition, a big feature of blues guitar playing. Okay, so now I'm moving along a little quicker. I've jumped ahead to the solo that comes along later in the song, and I'm a couple licks into this solo. Wanted to pull apart this one because it's another Stevie Ray Vaughan-ish sounding lick to me, also kind of Clapton sounding, and it features something pretty important. So again, we're here in just this 8th fret regular old minor pentatonic position. This lick opens up with a lick, I call this the Chuck Berry lick. I'm keeping my index finger anchored on the 8th fret on the top 2 strings, and then on the 10th fret, 3rd string here, I bend that note up and then go up those other 2 notes. I've always referred to that as the Chuck Berry lick because it's kind of something that you'd hear Chuck doing, like Johnny Be Good or whatever. So I'll play through this slowly here. A little faster. Okay, I really like this next lick that he uses to open up the second chorus of his solo here. It starts off with just a couple of long held bends, and what he's actually doing here, again, we're still in this C minor pentatonic off the 8th position, but this time he's grabbing this note on the 10th fret 2nd string, so not technically part of the scale, but then he takes that note and bends it up just a half step bend. So it's taking this note, bending it up to the pitch of that note. So effectively you're taking the 6th and bending it up to the flatted 7th. And he does that a few times. That idea of bending the 6th up to the flatted 7th is a big Treyism. He does that all the time. And so that B flat, the flatted 7th, fits well over the C7 chord. It's the flatted 7th of the C chord. And now as we change to the 4 chord, he just adapts this slightly, and instead of bending from the A up to the B flat, he's doing a pre-bend coming down to that A, and that A, in this case, it's the 6th of the C minor pentatonic scale, but it's also the major 3rd of the F chord, or the F7 chord, right there. So he just kind of morphed that bend the opposite direction to make it fit that F7 chord, and then he does a really cool thing. He grabs with his pinky this E flat, which actually happens to be the flatted 7th of the F chord, and then he does that same pre-bend thing. So that's a cool little trick that you can use off of an F chord right there. This next one's another quickie, and nothing super fancy, but I did want to show it to you because it brings us down into this 3rd position C minor pentatonic scale. Looks like this. And here again we have the minor 3rd. This time it's falling here on the 2nd string 4th fret. And again, just giving it a tiny little bend every time it comes up. And then he moves up here to the 6th fret and does a big long bend off of that too, all in the same position. Another quickie here, and again nothing super fancy, but I wanted to show it to you because it's in the caged D position, which is a little bit unusual. I'm looking, I guess, starting on the 3rd string. That little cluster of notes, but in particular he's playing off of this root, C on the 13th fret here, 2nd string. And then down here is the flatted 7th, so it's like... And again, using some repetition as a device to give his solo some coherence. Okay, now this next portion we're jumping into like 15th position off of this C minor chord here. And I'm seeing this C root here on the, I guess that's the 17th fret, 3rd string, 16th, 18th. So he's taking this note on the 18th fret, 2nd string, bending it up a couple times. And then here's that minor 3rd again on the 16th, bending it up, back and forth between the root and the flatted 7th. Then he kind of follows that up and does this little thing. So to slow that one down, another one of those pre-bend things. Finishes it off with that minor 3rd and giving it a slight bend. This lick features something that Trey does quite a bit too. So it starts off with a note up high, bending a B flat to the C. He's actually doing that on the 23rd fret. I actually only happen to have a 22 fret guitar in my hands right now, and even if I did have 24 frets, I really could barely, my fingers are too big to really reach those upper frets most of the time anyway. But he's bending a B flat up to a C on the 23rd fret, 2nd string. So up high there, and then right from that he dives back down to this 8th fret position, again back to this regular minor pentatonic, and he does this kind of variation of what I showed you earlier, that Chuck Berry thing where he goes... So now I got this finger anchored on those 2 strings, and then I'm bending this note on the 3rd string. Does that a couple times. That's another thing that I kind of put into that Chuck Berry category. And that, by the way, is something you'll see Trey do quite a bit. Like go for a high note, and then go for a big sounding lick down on this lower octave. That's something you'll hear him do quite often when he's going big in a solo. Then he finishes off by doing another bend here on the 11th fret, up to the 8th fret root there. Then he returns to that 11th fret, but this time he's going to slide it up 2 frets. which puts you back into this position that we started off the whole solo in. And again, there's that minor third that he's bending up a tiny bit. So this last lick that I'm going to pull apart here is again starting off in that same position that we started the whole solo off. This time though, he's taking that root note on the 13th fret and bending it up a step and a half, so he's bending a C up to the pitch of an E flat. And then it's those couple of notes, and then in order to shift up to the position above that, grabs that 11th fret, pull off to the 11th there, and now slide up to the 13th. Then grab this high G on the 15th. There's that minor third again, bending it a little bit. Root, flat, 7th, root. Very cool little lick using the caged system D shape there. Then he finishes the solo with a couple of big bends from that flatted 7th up to the root, 23rd fret on the 2nd string, so it would be like the octave higher than this. And a couple of blazing fast licks in the minor pentatonic position here on the 8th fret. So just to recap a couple of the takeaways from this solo, one I think is getting used to playing really fast licks, and you might check out some Stevie Ray Vaughan and that kind of thing, but some really fast licks in this basic minor pentatonic position. Another thing that Trey does a lot is where you're hitting a note and then hitting it again with a pre-bend and releasing that pre-bend. That minor third getting bent up. It's a big Treyism. Other things to keep in mind, like repetition. For example, there were a few places where I saw him do the exact same lick over the 1 chord and then over the 4 chord. Or even just some little repeated phrases like the way he attacks some of those notes, where I talked about raking into those bends like that. And then really just about any time he has a held note, giving it some good vibrato. So as is the case with most blues, it's not necessarily about having crazy fast chops or blazing through scales all that much. It's really about timing and phrasing and the way you attack your notes. To me, that's what's important about the blues and what you really want to take home. Now I have this whole solo transcribed note for note, and I will put a link to that PDF in the description of this video. So check out the whole thing, see if you can grab a few licks out of it that you can take to the bank.